Hello and welcome to Writing Winning Proposals, Advice from an Experienced Grant Reviewer. I'm Andy King, your host, and it's my pleasure today to introduce our main speaker, Mr. Dennis Norris. Dennis has been a grant writer for many years, but he's also served as a grant reviewer for the Indiana Department of Education, the Toshiba Corporation, and also Scholastic Publishing Company in New York. He's a published author and a national trainer on the topics of grant writing and grant management. And he has served as the executive director of several large nonprofit organizations. From 2009 till 2016, Dennis worked for the Central Asia Development Group, managing funding efforts for the reconstruction and rehabilitation of Afghanistan and Western Africa. He's currently the executive director for Progress House, which is Indiana's oldest and largest drug and alcohol rehabilitation and recovery center. Dennis also serves as a facilitator for the Vista Resource Development online course. A little later in the presentation, we will be hearing from Sarah Jordan Schwartz. Sarah Jordan is a Vista alum who served with Mentor Greenville in Greenville, South Carolina, and who now has a development position with the Children's Museum of the Lowcountry in Charleston, South Carolina. During today's session, you'll see Bethany DeSablin and Joanne Lau in the chat providing support and answering your questions along the way. So now let's take a look at the goals for our session. By the end of our webinar, we hope that you'll be able to, first of all, distinguish between a grant and a gift, and then you'll be able to draft an effective letter of inquiry. We also hope that you'll be able to appeal to grant reviewers by including information that makes your grant proposal exceptional so that yours will stand out from the crowd. And also that you'll view each grant proposal that you submit as an opportunity to learn and to improve your chances for getting funded. So I want to say thanks to all of you who responded to the pre-webinar chat activity about your experience with grant writing or proposal writing. Some of you identified potential funders through your research. Others have been involved in writing at various degrees. Some of you mentioned that you've already gotten some funding, and many of you have not yet even had a chance to try. And some of you haven't even gotten your feet wet yet, but that's okay. You all have varying levels of experience with the topic, and on this webinar, we hope that you'll get to take away some information that'll be helpful no matter where you are in that spectrum as you continue to develop resources for your organization. All right, so we've seen our session goals. We have a sense of where you are with your experience, and really no matter where you are, we hope you'll be able to gain something. So now I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Dennis Norris.
Thanks, Andy. Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to be here today, and I want to thank you for your time in participating. Learning about what grants are, how to obtain them, and how to have your proposal stand out to a grant reviewer is always an important topic, especially these days when the competition for grant dollars is at an all-time high. To get a sense of what you're all working towards, I'd like you to weigh in on this chat question. What is your fundraising goal as a VISTA? How much money are you expected to raise? If you don't have a specific dollar amount, if there is a specific activity, event, or project you are hoping to fund, tell us about that. Please enter your response in the chat box and make sure you send to all participants so everyone can see.
All right, well, we've got a lot of responses coming in right now. I've seen numbers everywhere from $500 for a single program, $5,000, all the way up to hearing that the previous VISTA raised $350,000, which is pretty amazing. Lots of things in between, $2,000, $7,000, $20,000, all the way up to $100,000. Caitlin says $300,000. Wow, that's a big goal for 1 year. But many of you don't have a specific goal. Either it's not specified or you're mentioning that you're trying to support a particular project, and as the project develops, the needs will be better defined, and so that way your fundraising fee responsive to the program as it develops. So Dennis, any trends that you're seeing here, anything that of interest you want to call out?
Really big amounts for some folks, which is a kind of a stark contrast to the previous chat activity, which said a lot of you don't have a lot of experience. So that's okay. Don't worry about that. We're going to take away a lot of the fear today in this webinar. So, but really interesting and diverse comments. I think it's obvious that no matter what levels of funds you're expected to raise, you're going to have to do that in a variety of different ways. And one of those methods will be to obtain grant funding. So I remember the first time that I was asked to write a grant proposal. I had absolutely no idea what a grant was or what I was supposed to do. I asked around to people who thought I could help or who I thought could help me, but instead of help, I got a lot of chuckles and many responses like, good luck with that. So in the end, I just decided to follow the funder's directions, to keep it simple, and to just spell out what it is that I wanted. The first few grants I wrote were funded, followed by a tremendously long dry spell, followed by a bit more success, and then another dry spell. And that's just how it goes. No one gets them all, but this webinar will boost your chances and provide you with a glimpse of what the other side, which is the side of the grant reviewer, looks for in a solid proposal. One thing is for certain, if you don't submit grant proposals for funding, you have a 100% chance of failure. Hopefully this webinar will take some of the fear away and make you more competitive in obtaining grant funds. Okay, moving ahead, let's talk about the difference between a gift and a grant, because they are definitely not the same thing. And it is very important that you understand the difference between the two before you tackle a grant. Okay, most gifts come from individual donors after they are solicited for it in some manner, like face-to-face or email or snail mail, special event, whatever. And most money comes from middle to low income people, contrary to popular belief that you have to know a lot of rich people to raise money. Grants, on the other hand, mainly come from foundations. It is a transfer of money from a funding organization, or a funder, as I will call them throughout this presentation, to a qualified institution, a nonprofit organization for our purposes, to accomplish the nonprofit's initiatives. Grants are given quite often to explore creative approaches to existing problems or issues, like hunger or domestic violence or the environment, or to support approaches that have already been proven effective, like stem cell research or low-income housing construction or veterans benefits. You have to write a proposal to get a grant, or at least some type of formal document that outlines your project and lists how you will measure your project's success. Gifts, conversely, are also known as donations or charitable contributions and often come after some relationship building has occurred. People are often drawn to a cause and want to give a donation to support a nonprofit's mission. Often gifts can be used for anything like salaries or programs, equipment, vehicles, operations, that sort of thing, whereas grants, which are often referred to as contracts or agreements, have to be applied to a specific initiative. A couple of last points about gifts versus grants. When you give a gift to a nonprofit organization, unless it is an anonymous gift, you'll end up in their donor database. The nonprofit owns that list, and they cannot give or sell your name to another nonprofit unless you give them permission. But when you get a grant from a foundation or corporation, that is public information. So I'm able to see each grant that you've received and each grant that a funder has provided. Also, when you give a gift, you get an acknowledgement of some sort, and that usually has information on how much you may write off on your taxes. With a grant, you get a binding legal contract that must be signed, returned, and adhered to throughout. In order to keep their tax status as a foundation, a funder must give away a portion of their income each year. And again, for this reason, all of their information is public and easily accessible. Their board members, their assets, how many grants they've given, how to contact them, funding programs, etc. You must account for every penny of a grant, and you must measure the results of your project. So a formal binding contract is included when you are awarded a grant. So why is the distinction between a gift and a grant so important? Because the language used in seeking gifts and grants is very, very different. This is critical to remember. And if you take away this bullet point, and only this bullet point from this webinar, you will be miles ahead of most of your competition in the grant field. People give with their hearts first when making a gift, so fundraising and marketing materials intended to solicit gifts are written to strike a chord in a person's heart. Writing that attempts to pull on a donor's heartstrings is appropriate in a fundraising appeal, but not in a grant proposal. A grant is a contractual business relationship, so grant correspondence should always be professional, clear, concise, and devoid of flowery or emotion-laden language. You want to convey to your potential funder that you are prepared to meet their philanthropic goals with your proposed project. Okay, the language used in asking for a gift should cause an emotional reaction or response. It should tug on the heartstrings. So here's an example from the Wounded Warrior Project so you can see the contrast. The gift language on this slide is obviously attempting to evoke an emotional response and strike a chord with the donor. The writing attempts to make donors mad or sad or happy or whatever emotion does the job. Fundraising language like this is more salesy and is designed to market the mission of the organization. Smart nonprofits often have several marketing messages that are tied together and used throughout their various sources of media, like website, print, social media, or written materials. The grant language is more professional, crisp, and clear. It is more businesslike and to the point. The example on this slide is obviously not attempting to evoke an emotional response. Instead, we are presenting factual information in an effort to receive ongoing funding for our projects, whatever they are. We are not trying to sell anything here. We are trying to establish a partnership in which we do a project that yields specific results and a funder provides the money for that effort. So making a grant reviewer smile has a lot to do with both the content of your writing and the style in which you write it. Grant reviewers can tell through the writing of a letter of inquiry or a proposal whether or not the applicant is properly prepared for the task. If the writing is more for a fundraising piece than a grant, a reviewer will assume the applicant does not know the difference between the two, and a level of confidence will have been lost with the reviewer. That is why a gift versus grant language is so important. If the language is businesslike and professional, the reviewer can tell that the applicant gets it and will maintain that understanding throughout the submission of reports and the stewardship of funds once they are received. If the structure of the proposal is haphazard and less than seamless, it is not hard for the reviewer to imagine that the management of the project will carry forward in the same way. Also, as a reviewer, it's fairly easy to tell when an applicant has bitten off more than they can chew. You cannot solve the world's hunger issue, but you might be able to help 300 people on the south side of your city. So if you want the grant reviewer to smile, you should never promise what you cannot deliver. And sticking with the hunger issue, a grant reviewer will expect that you have a solid grasp on the problem. If you simply state that people are hungry in your city, that will make your reviewer suspicious that you may not have done your homework. Instead, if you provide solid and recent data on the problem and demonstrate that you have a deep understanding of the issue, you are once again instilling that very important level of confidence in the grant reviewer. Grant research is an entire topic in and of itself, and it's not a topic for this webinar. But just know that grant research has to be done in order to find the right funder for your project. There are many ways to do that research, and the best way to find out more is to visit the Foundation Center's website at www.foundationcenter.org. Okay, let me walk you through a typical grant process, which usually starts with the need for something that we would like to receive a gift for, a gift that we are probably never going to get. So you have to turn your thinking around, and Project C.R.O.A.K is a perfect example for that. Project C.R.O.A.K stands for Creeks, Rivers, Oceans, and Kids. I used to be a grant writer for a large school district in Indianapolis, and one day I was approached by a group of third-grade teachers who said that they had a desire for more computers in their classroom. My response to them was, well, okay, name me one other third-grade class that doesn't have the same desire. In other words, they simply wanted a gift of computers, and they were probably not going to get one, especially in a public school district. So instead of a desire for computers, we had to come up with a creative approach to an existing problem, which, remember, is the definition of a grant, for which the acquisition of computers would have to be a peripheral byproduct. So luckily, that very same year, their school was given a curriculum emphasis of environmental science, so that everything they taught, from math to spelling to science, emphasized the environment. And luckily, a creek ran behind their school. So one day we walked to the creek and I asked them, how do we capitalize on the good fortune of having an environmental emphasis school with a creek running behind it? And that's when Project C.R.O.A.K was born. The creek is part of a watershed leading to the Gulf of Mexico. So we set up partner schools along the watershed, and at the beginning of the year, a fictitious frog was released into the creek. During the school year, kids along the watershed would report on what it was about their segment of the watershed that could hurt or help the frog as he made his way downstream. So there were two problems we sought to address with this project. The first being that kids needed to learn at an earlier age about the interconnectivity of the environment, or the fact that throwing trash into the creek ultimately affects everyone who lives along the creek. And the second was that kids needed to learn at an earlier age how to work and learn in teams. So there was plenty of research to back up our claims on this. So how did we get started with Project C.R.O.A.K? Well, I did some grant research looking for funders who had as their philanthropic interest the partnering with public schools and the teaching of children about the environment. I located the National Environmental Education and Training Foundation in Washington, D.C., whose philanthropic interests match our project perfectly. Their instructions included a letter of inquiry, or LOI, as the initial approach, and we'll learn more about these shortly. So I wrote an LOI using a non-fundraising, business-centered writing style, striving to stay very clear and concise above all else. This project could be described as cute and fun, but we didn't want our writing to be cute or fun. So what happened? The project was first funded by the National Environmental Education and Training Foundation, and after that, IBM even offered to buy it from us. Project C.R.O.A.K won a national award for project creativity and implementation, and it led to another project called the Signals Project, and that led to the Jason Project, which is tied to Dr. Robert Ballard, the gentleman who discovered the Titanic. And in the end, there were millions put into the school district, and the Jason Project was moved eventually to the Children's Museum of Indianapolis. Needless to say, that the third grade teachers and all of the third grade partner schools got more computers than they knew what to do with. In fact, the desire for computers became almost forgotten as teachers really got into the project and the problems that we were solving. This is a really good example of how the need for a gift can turn into a grant opportunity and the business relationship that it generated. So let's review that process once again, using this flow chart to help us. Through my grant research, I identified a funder and ensured that their philanthropic goals met the parameters of my project. Next, I simply followed their directions. If they wanted me to call them, I would have called them. If they wanted me to email them a synopsis of my project, I would have emailed them. More than likely, a funder will ask you to write a letter of inquiry, commonly called an LOI, and that is what they did. Sometimes they will skip the LOI and ask you for a full proposal. Since these two options will be about 95% of what you see, we will focus in this webinar on both the LOI and the full proposal. Once I was successful and obtained the grant, I received a notice of the award, and then I was free to implement the project with my new business partner. Okay, as mentioned, the vast majority of funders out there will ask you for an LOI. Throughout these next sections, I'm going to explain what a grant reviewer expects to see, but I'm also going to tell you how to make that particular section exceptional in their eyes. An LOI is exactly that, a letter of inquiry to a potential funder asking whether or not they are interested in your project and want to see more of it through a full proposal. Trying to impress a funder with fancy writing, jargon, or flowery adjectives will only annoy them. LOIs should be razor-sharp in focus and content with no extra words. The first paragraph should say it all and then be briefly supported by the rest of the letter. Exceptional LOIs can be read and completely understood by the reviewer in mere seconds. Remember, funders read hundreds of these things, and the way to make yours stand out is to be brief and clear. You are trying to make your way into the first cut. Your program will have measurable objectives, and your grant reviewer will want to see that you understand this. Your LOI then should very briefly include these objectives and how they will be achieved. You don't have to be extremely detailed in an LOI. Just show your reviewer that you understand that measurable objectives are the most important part of your project. Don't forget the purpose of an LOI. You are not asking for funds. You are asking for the opportunity to submit a proposal. You will mention how much money you want, of course, but the reason for an LOI is to interest the funder in your submission of a full proposal. Now we'd like to take a little time to hear from Sarah Jordan Schwartz. Sarah Jordan is, oh, I'm sorry, Andy, this is your part.
No worries. Yeah, so thank you, Dennis. And as I mentioned earlier, we are going to hear from one of your colleagues. As Dennis said, Sarah Jordan Schwartz. She's here to talk a little bit about her experience in writing grants. As I said earlier, she's a VISTA alum. She completed her VISTA service in August of 2015, so last year. She served with the United Way of Greenville County's partnering organization, which is called Mentor Greenville, in Greenville, South Carolina. Her VISTA position there focused on grant writing as well as on volunteer recruitment. Sarah Jordan currently works at the Children's Museum of the Lowcountry, which is in Charleston, South Carolina, and there she serves as their campaign coordinator. So Sarah Jordan, thanks for joining us.
Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here. My service as a VISTA focused primarily on helping Mentor Greenville expand its program offering by securing funding. I wrote a lot of LOIs, and when invited, I submitted full grant proposals. Some of the things I did to prepare to write an LOI were I collected and reviewed my organization's previously funded and denied grant requests. I read through them for purposes of learning the language the organization uses to speak about itself, but also to try and identify why projects were successful or unsuccessful. I did see a need for putting in place a filing system to organize past grants and highlight future grants to go for. Connect with a grant reviewer, and if available, see if you can sit with the reviewers while they are reviewing grants so that you can hear the kinds of things that they are looking for and the kinds of questions they are asking. In my case, because our organization is an affiliate of United Way, there are grant review meetings that happen, and I was able to sit in. I researched grantors' past giving and requirements for an LOI or proposal. It helped me to see if they were interested in funding general operating because we were restructuring our mentoring program, and we were looking for that. I did this via their website, but also by looking up their 990 on GuideStar.org. I found section 15 and the pages listing the previous year's giving, amount granted, and support type to be most helpful. Dennis will speak more about the 990 later in the presentation. Make contact with a representative at the funding agency. Don't be afraid to contact someone from the granting organization before you submit your LOI. It's also good for you to be on their radar. For instance, I ask questions about what models they prefer. Are they partial to outcomes-based models, or would they be willing to fund something that doesn't have strict research detailing outcomes? I also have asked loads of questions about outcomes, goals, and objectives. Some organizations have strict thoughts about these, so you want to make sure you're using their verbiage when you write. Which brings me to my last point. Use grant language that the grantor uses to describe your program. For example, if a grantor states that their mission is to support innovative and creative educational programs, then the words innovative and creative educational programs need to be found in your LOI or proposal.
Okay. Thanks so much, Sarah Jordan. You shared some great tips on writing an LOI, and I want to just echo a few of them. You mentioned the research you did, researching past grants your organization received and researching the past giving done by the funder. These are great strategies to help you focus your efforts on what's most likely to yield positive results. You also talked about how you reached out to the funder to get more detail on what they're looking for. While not all funders will make time to walk through this information, it's good to start the relationship building process. All right, so that's the letter of inquiry, or LOI. We're going to move on and talk about what comes after. Okay, on the right side of your screen, a poll will appear. Click one of the answers and hit the Submit button, and your answer will be recorded.
And I'll mention for those of you who've joined us via a mobile device, you won't be able to find the quiz. That's one of the downsides of the mobile application, and one of the benefits of being on a computer is you can take part in the poll. So it looks like our poll has closed. The results are going to tabulate here in just a couple of seconds, so we'll see those coming in. And Dennis, I'll turn it back over to you so you can cue us up with the right answer.
Okay, and the correct answer to the quiz is C, submit a standard proposal format. So what the heck is that? That's what I'm going to show you now, okay? But first, it's critical to remember this. Whenever a funder provides you instructions on what to write and how to write it, those must be followed to the letter. Everything you're about to learn is not applicable when the funder provides instructions. Instructions rise above everything else. So in the absence of instructions, which will be the norm, there is a loose industry standard that you can follow, and that's what I'm going to show you now. Okay, a standard 10-page proposal. When a funder asks for a proposal, that typically means a 10-page document with certain elements, which we will walk through next. If they ask for a 5-page proposal or a 3-page or a 7-page or whatever, it still needs all of these elements, but you must reduce them proportionally. There will normally be no mention of a page count. So in cases like that, a 10-page proposal is an industry standard that you will be safe to follow. More and more these days, you will see that a funder does not want to speak with you, does not want you to email them, but does in fact want either an LOI or a proposal as the initial approach. It's not that they're unfriendly, but you are competing with many other people and the volume is just too heavy for them. If you make it through the first cut, then there almost certainly will be an actual person with whom you can speak. Most people in this field agree that a proposal must have certain elements, but you may hear them called different terms. For instance, instead of a need statement, you may see problem statement. Instead of methods, you may see activities. Instead of an executive summary, you may be asked to write a concept paper. These are all pretty interchangeable things. So a standard 10-page proposal usually consists of elements you see here within the page parameters you see. Are these page parameters set in stone? Absolutely not. But if you choose not to even loosely follow this framework, you will quickly find yourself in that lack of confidence pile on a reviewer's desk. For instance, the methods section of a proposal is the meat of your program. If you only write half a page on what you plan to do and then write 3 pages of an introduction, for instance, then your proposal is way out of proportion, and it will become obvious to the reviewer that you do not understand which sections hold the most importance to them. Okay, the executive summary is the cover page of a proposal, explaining to the funder in brief terms who you are, what you want, and what you plan to use their funding for. Does this sound familiar? Because it should. It mimics the LOI, and the two can be somewhat interchangeable. An executive summary, however, should be a bit more expansive. An executive summary can also be used later as the framework for press releases or marketing tools. And this is very important for you to know. An executive summary is typically the last thing written in a grant proposal, but it's the first thing and quite often the only thing read by a reviewer, at least in their first pass. If you don't write a good, crisp, easy-to-read executive summary, chances are you will go no further. When I write a grant proposal, I usually set it down for a few days when I'm finished, and then I go back and I write the executive summary with fresh eyes. I agonize over these things because I want my words to be laser-focused. Why? Because I know, and now so do you, that the executive summary is either going to open the gate for me or close it. And, of course, I want to make it through that first cut so I can walk through the gate and get one step closer to the grant. The introduction. Use the introduction to get acquainted with or to shake hands with your funder. Tell them who you are and why you exist. If you are here to help single mothers, then briefly tell the grant funder why that is so important. Show why your organization is relevant to the community. If there is an award for your organization that they've received or a major grant that it has obtained, then tell the reviewer about it. Don't be shy. But if you are an organization serving single mothers and you won an award for the best tug-of-war team at the annual picnic, then you'll want to leave that out. However, if your organization serves single mothers and your board is made up of 1/3 previous clients, then that is something important to mention. So in other words, introduce yourself, but stay relevant to the grant for which you are applying. Okay, right after the introduction comes the goal statement and the related objectives. Don't be fooled by the fact that this section is less than a page. The goal statement and measurable objectives are the most important part of any proposal. And interestingly, it's a place where many grant writers fall short. So let's look at what needs to be included. A goal is a desired result that a person or an organization envisions, plans, and commits to achieve. A goal is something that is ambitious but still achievable. For instance, a goal may be to reduce the number of homeless individuals in your community. The goal doesn't go into specifics, but it clearly says what you intend to accomplish. It describes what success looks like. Objectives are smaller scale outcomes that add up to the overall goal. They define what will be accomplished by each individual strategy or implementation step to attain the goal. Your objectives will allow you to accurately measure the effectiveness of your program towards the attainment of that goal. It's important to write SMART objectives, and by that I mean objectives that are specific. It details exactly what will be accomplished. Measurable, the outcome is defined in a way that can be measured. Attainable, the target is something that is possible to achieve. Relevant, the objective relates to the overall goal. And time-bound, there's a defined completion date. Any objective is attainable if you have unlimited time. So SMART objectives are important for any type of work plan, not just for grant proposals. And I'm guessing that many of you are familiar with them. But it's good to be reminded to include them in any grant proposal. You'd be surprised how many submissions don't include them. So what is a grant reviewer looking for in your goal statement and objectives? Because they're so short, they need to be extremely well written. It will be immediately clear to a reviewer if your objectives aren't SMART, if they're poorly written, or if they miss the mark. Furthermore, objectives serve as your roadmap. These are the things you will measure in your approach to the problem or issue. The funder gives you money because he or she believes you can reach your objectives with your creative approach. Objectives are important because if you are successful, the funder not only has met its own philanthropic goal, but perhaps your program can be replicated, and the entire community will continue to improve based on your approach. So a good example of this would be stem cell research as a treatment for certain types of cancer. At some point, a funder took a chance on this creative approach to the problem of cancer. Once this proved to be a successful approach, more and more funding became available, and the process of stem cell research was repeated and enhanced. So, exceptional objectives are those that do a very good job of measuring, because this makes the process of replicating or even not replicating that much more important. Remember, Thomas Edison tried 1,000 different ways to make a light bulb, and when asked about his success, he placed the emphasis on his failures because he learned of 999 ways not to make a light bulb.
All right, we're going to pause here in the content presentation and turn back to you, our audience, to give you a chance to engage a little bit and give you a chance to apply what you've just learned about the goal statement and the objectives that Dennis talked about. So to do this activity, you're going to use the chat panel as you've been doing before. And if your chat panel isn't open, please open it now by clicking on the triangle next to the word chat, or by clicking the speech bubble icon, which is up in the right corner of your screen. If you are joining us on a mobile device, you can go to the participants menu, scroll all the way to the bottom, and I believe there you will find a link to the chat application, which will open up. It will overlay the slides. All right, so we're going to begin the activity with the next slide.
Okay. Objectives are where everyone seems to get in trouble, as I mentioned. Let's look at two examples and see what's good about them and what can be improved. The goal, for this example, the goal of the Signals project is to address the lack of science curriculum in middle schools for at-risk girls. So a goal statement, that's pretty solid. It's not unattainable, but it would be hard to achieve. So let's look at two related objectives. Okay, the first one is to increase class offerings in biology, chemistry, and physics by 10% each year over a 3-year period. So in the chat box, say what is good about this objective or what could be better.
All right, so we've got folks who are really paying attention. A number of you mentioned it's measurable. They see the numbers in there. They see the specificity, the time bound. There's a time period mentioned there. And a couple of you have mentioned that it seems like it's relevant to the overall goal.
Good. So this objective is pretty smart. At the end of the project, we will be able to say yes or no on whether we met this objective. So let's look at another objective. Instill a love of science among middle school girls. Again, in the chat, say what is good about this objective or what could be better.
All right, so of course everyone says, how do you measure this? It's not measurable. So that's one thing that jumped out to a lot of you. It's not very specific. You know, what is love? How do you define that? And how do you measure, someone asked, how do you measure at risk? So that goes back to the overall goal statement. So maybe there's some specificity there that could be added to the goal.
Yeah, I agree, Andy. This objective needs some work. It's probably relevant to the goal, but as many of you noted, it's not very specific. It's not really measurable either. As one of you said, how do you measure love? And there's no time frame. So the project would have until infinity, I guess, to meet this objective. So really good work on this. It's clear that you're seeing how to tell if objective statements are smart. Remember to construct your goals and objectives in the correct manner, because if you do not, you will find it very difficult, if not impossible, to be funded. Now let's move on and look at the next section of the standard grant proposal. The needs statement or problem statement shows the funder that you've done your homework and you know what you're talking about. Going back to Project C.R.O.A.K, remember that the initial desire was for more computers, something that every third grade teacher in America has a desire for. We turned that desire around to focus on the two problems existing in the field of environmental education for children. Aesthetically, when you write a needs statement, it's best to form an inverted wedge or an upside-down triangle by presenting your findings on a wider scale, then honing it down to a regional or statewide scale, and then honing it down one step further to show how the problem affects you locally or even how your problem affects a single individual. With Project C.R.O.A.K, I started with national environmental education statistics and a quote from a famous scientist about why environmental education is so important. Then I showed a graphic from the Indiana Department of Education on how team learning was more effective than individual learning. After that, I looked at the individual schools' statewide scores in both math and science, which were low, and tried to incorporate an increase in those scores into my objectives. I did not paint a picture of such gloom and doom that the proposal reviewer would think, oh my gosh, this problem is unsolvable. But I did have solid research backing up my claims, and I presented it all in a very graphical and easy to understand manner. My 1 1/2 page needs assessment looks somewhat like a miniature research paper, complete with footnotes and quotes. So also avoid the jargon of your profession. Don't assume your grant reviewer knows the terms and vocabulary of your field, because most likely they do not.
All right, so since you all did so well on that last activity, we're going to give you another chance to apply what you just learned, this time about the needs statement. And again, we're going to use the chat panel. So a few of you had your comments end up in the Q&A, so be sure you've got that chat panel open so that you can participate and everybody will be able to see your responses. So this activity that we're going to do relates to the needs statement, and it's going to begin on the next slide. So remember, a good needs statement refers to published research. It frames the issue widely and then narrows down to the specific community, and then it demonstrates the importance of the issue, but without resorting to that doom and gloom. So what you're going to do in this activity is read a condensed version of a needs assessment, and we recognize this one is not very good. It needs a little improvement. So we're going to ask you to suggest ways to make it better. So if everyone's ready, we will show you that needs statement.
Okay, as Andy mentioned, this is a very condensed version of a needs statement. I'll read to you now. In his speech to the United Nations in 2015, President Obama stated that childhood hunger is our nation's #1 priority. Following that declaration, the state of Indiana committed $50 million towards programs fighting childhood obesity and mandated that soda machines be removed from all elementary and middle school cafeterias. In the Indianapolis public school systems, soda machines were removed from all schools and student blood pressure was monitored throughout the 2015-2016 school year. The result was a lowering of blood pressure for over 55% of the student body. So you may have noticed a few things about this needs statement that aren't perfect. Use the chat, again, to share what you think could be improved about this needs statement. What suggestions do you have for ways to make it better?
Yeah, and for a group that had a lot of people saying they had no experience, you've got really sharp eyes. So, so a few of you pointed out that it doesn't really state the need very clearly. It talks about correlation, but there's no real data cited here that shows the causal relationship between some of these things like soda machines and childhood hunger and obesity. Like, how are all those things related? There's kind of a lack of organization. It seems a little confusing the way, the order in which the information is presented. You know, Rory points out, is the soda the only thing that we should be focusing on here? So it seems like it's all over the map. There's a mix of information in there.
Yeah, I agree, Andy. This needs statement doesn't really give any local data on the scale of the problem in the state or in the local community. It mentions that the state mandate removing soda machines from schools, but it doesn't reference the research making the link from soda to obesity. Did you notice how it mixes some of the methods or strategies and results into the need statement? This is an easy mistake to make. Since this is just about the need, it would be better to talk about obesity and blood pressure rates among students in the Indianapolis schools and the link between soda and obesity and blood pressure. So leave the strategies or the past results for the next section. Okay, well, this was just a quick example of what goes into a needs statement and how to make sure it's focused to support your proposal. Let's move on and look at the next section of the standard proposal format. Remember how this all started with your project? You said something like, what if we did this? Well, that's what the methods section is. It's your plan. This will be the bulk of your proposal, about 4 pages. A methods section maps out each step of the way for your project, what you will do the first day, the first week, the first year. Each method you propose must always lead to the completion of one of your objectives. Going back to Project C.R.O.A.K example again, my methods section was quite expansive. I listed all of the partner schools along the watershed. I inserted a timeline as to when the frog was scheduled to appear in their section of the watershed. I explained in detail what was expected of each school, and then told the funder how we would produce a comprehensive CD of the project when it was completed. The methods section can also include a brief introduction of the primary personnel involved in the implementation and management of the project, further instilling confidence in the funder, especially if the personnel are exceptionally qualified or have managed grants in the past. Also, periodic measurements of the project's progress can be explained in the methods section. Here again, we did this with Project C.R.O.A.K after each partner school's participation. This way, we could tell whether or not our measurable objectives were in line. The evaluation section is best defined as the method by which you will measure your objectives. What instrument will you use to determine your level of success or failure? Evaluations include pre-test and post-test, surveys, knowledge gains, and several different methods that really depend upon the type of program you're implementing. Evaluation should tie into both the need statement and, of course, the objectives. In the need statement, you have shown that you understand the problem by presenting current and reliable resources. The measurement of your objectives should add to the field in some manner. Perhaps your project will be so successful that someday another grant writer cites your findings in his or her needs assessment. Evaluation should include a brief explanation as to how you plan to get the word out on what you've done. For example, a white paper may be produced that you post on your webpage and that of the funder. However this is done, it will be your responsibility to disseminate your findings so that others may see what does or even what does not work. Your funder will want to know whether or not you met your objectives, and they will want you to spread the word about your project. So from both an educational and marketing standpoint, it's really good for both of you. It's very important for you to relate to your funder that you do not see them as your sole investor for eternity. They will want to know if you have sought other funding, someone with whom they can share the load. If not, they will want to know how you plan to sustain your project over time with more grants or private donations or whatever. Your method for sustainability is important, yes, but not as important as acknowledging to your funder that you get it once again and that you understand that one day their funding will go away. Also, don't forget to tell your funder if in-kind contributions are included by you or others. For example, consulting services, facilities, equipment, or anything that has a value associated with it other than real dollars. Be sure your budget accurately reflects the activities of your project. Don't include budget items that are strictly forbidden by the funder. If that information is not known, then you can assume any category may be funded, like salaries or consultant fees, supplies, insurance, whatever. Always prepare a brief paragraph explaining the numbers. You don't have to be extremely detailed because the numbers speak for themselves, but having a text-based explanation often helps the reviewer understand what you want. Unless directed otherwise, it's always best to separate those costs associated with personnel, like salaries, consultant fees, taxes, etc., from those not associated with personnel, like supplies, postage, vehicles, etc. This practice just makes for a clean, well-segmented budget that is easier to understand. Whenever I review for grants, I am told to disregard any proposal whose authors clearly did not follow directions. In the absence of instructions or directions, you are safe following standard format, font, and page limits. The picture on the screen is of a short $10 book that I bought early in my career that I've never stopped using. The PC is not a typewriter, but there's also the Mac is not a typewriter, and it's by Robin Williams. It is a great resource to help you brush up on desktop publishing 101 elements in order to submit a professional-looking proposal. This little book is packed with so much valuable information. I bet I pick this book up every 6 months or so just to check on something. So, okay, again, we're going to hear from Sarah Jordan with her tips about proposal writing. Sarah Jordan?
Recently at the museum, I've been working to secure some funding for outreach programming, and I'm writing a lot of grants and LOIs. Some of the resources that I use come from a few places. I use shapingtheoutcomes.org. It's got a great tutorial and course on understanding objectives, outcomes, and goals and how they work together. I also use networkforgood.com or networkforgood.org, and they've got great webinars and articles. And then I use the complete book of grant writing by Nancy Burke Smith and E. Gabriel Works. And it actually has 2 examples of LOIs. This was given to me by another grant writer, and I have consulted it many times. I also consult the Foundation Center, and Dennis mentioned that a couple of slides back. Ask someone removed from the project to read the LOI or grant. Fresh eyes will be able to identify holes and things that don't make sense. Have a solid, feasible sustainability plan. Money is tight, and grantors want to know that the effect of their giving will last beyond the funding cycle. Make sure you speak to how the program will continue once their funding is used. An example from my own experience was with a local grantor we asked to help start a mental health center within the after-school program many of our students attended. This particular grantor is very specific about the sustainability plan. It's literally the make or break funding. So I worked with local counselors and universities to create a sustainability plan that not only kept the center going, but helped out counselors seeking extra certifications. By offering their counseling services at no cost, counselors received hours toward their extra certifications. The grantor loved it and the project is doing really well. If reapplying or applying for a proven program, send photos, examples of work, quotes from participants. These are also great in thank you letters. Quotes from participants will strengthen a proposal in addition to any research or findings from your program you have. If your request is denied, ask if you can speak to someone from the committee to learn how to strengthen your proposal for the next round. While working with Mentor Greenville, we applied for a grant that we didn't receive. When I thanked the grantor for their time and asked for feedback, I got a phone call from the agency explaining that they preferred third-party evaluations over in-house evaluations. I found that granting organizations were more open to talking to me as a VISTA versus someone who is an employee of the organization. Always approach feedback as a learning opportunity. And lastly, use your library. Some libraries have nonprofit series where trained individuals come in and speak on a plethora of topics, from researching grants to donor retention to creating a successful volunteer corps. Libraries may also have subscriptions to grant databases such as foundationcenter.org or grants.gov.
Okay, thanks again, Sarah Jordan, for your tips and information. Very, very helpful. So what happens when you are funded? If you're funded, be sure that the funder has not altered your proposal in any way, especially the measurable objectives. For instance, if they want to add an objective that you were not considering, then you need to determine whether or not this additional objective will cost money, and if so, how much. Or if they want to fund everything except for the consultant you need for your project, if that is the case, then you may need to alter some of your objectives and or evaluation and find this money elsewhere or take it out completely. This kind of thing does not happen often, but it does happen. So be sure your proposal is being funded in its entirety as it was submitted. If not, renegotiate the terms of your proposal. Once you come to an agreement, determine when and how your actual money comes in. It may come all at once, it may come half now, half at some benchmark point in your project, or you may have to use your own money up front and then apply for reimbursement. Know all of this before you sign. Of course, not being funded feels like the end of the world, but it can be a valuable learning tool. Always take the opportunity to thank the funder for their consideration of your proposal and request they send you information as to why that decision was made. Sometimes they will even copy the evaluator sheets and send them to you. Sarah Jordan mentioned this one already, and they were more than willing to provide the feedback she asked for. So after you look these over, you may decide to try again. That is the perfect chance to reconnect with the funder to see if that is even permissible. Of course, complaining about the funder does no good at all and may cause you harm. Remember, it's not personal, and the philanthropic world is a very small one. I try to view the rejection of a grant proposal as a really good edit of my project by unbiased outside individuals. Perhaps the reviewers all saw some programmatic gap that I did not, or perhaps I have bitten off more than I can chew with my proposal. Whatever the case, being able to see grant reviewers' notes is an incredibly smart thing to do. Personally, on those occasions when I have not been awarded a grant, I have never once been told by the funder that I could not see the reviewer's notes. So let's look at some resources that are available to you now that you know more about what a grant reviewer wants to see. There are some resources on the Vista campus to help you with the researching portion of grant writing, and these are valuable tools in locating all types of grants, really. A good resource is the Researching Grants tutorial, where you can learn where to find local and national grant resources. It's packed with information to help you locate potential grants. There is also a webinar entitled Researching Grants, Finding the Right Opportunities for Your Project. This recorded webinar focuses on grant research and relationship building, and it explores different techniques for finding grant opportunities that meet your organization's specific needs through real-world stories from VISTA members. In my opinion, and as I mentioned earlier, the best resource for grant research and information is the Foundation Center at foundationcenter.org. Not only can you search through the Foundation Center online database where you can find virtually any existing grant opportunity, but you can also engage in tutorials, read several articles, and employ sample tools to help you along the way. GrantSpace at grantspace.org is another excellent resource that offers a learning community specifically designed to meet the needs of grant seekers. GrantSpace, by the way, is a site run by the Foundation Center, so it has that same high caliber of information. I believe that GuideStar.org is a close second to the Foundation Center in terms of being an effective grant resource, but you have to dig a little bit. GuideStar gathers and disseminates information about nonprofits, and that includes their IRS 990 tax forms. An IRS Form 990 is a lengthy tax form that every nonprofit agency must complete each year. It is full of information that is all public record. When you look at a 990, you immediately get the IRS form butterflies in the pit of your stomach because it appears to be horribly complicated. But it's actually very simple, and there is really only one place you need to go, and that is Section 15. It is there you will learn whether or not the nonprofit received any grants in that fiscal year, who the grants were from, and how much they were for. Looking at the 990s of your competitors is perfectly legal and acceptable, and it's an excellent way to develop a long list of funders interested in your mission and the similar missions of your colleagues. If you're smart, you will find out who is doing the same kind of work as you. Go to GuideStar.org and take a peek at their 990s. I do it all the time. GrantsAlert.com is a place to find education grants, and in my experience has the most expansive and comprehensive listing of those. And finally, grants.gov is a place to find federal grants. Don't be afraid of federal grants. For any one federal program, there is often an army of individuals called program officers ready to assist you. And for very large federal programs, there are usually introductory or instructional webinars like this one, or instructional videos, and sometimes even day-long conferences held in major cities for potential applicants. Federal grants are often the largest grants available, and yes, you will have to work a little bit harder for those. But in the end, after having received and managed several myself, several large multi-million-dollar federal grants, and some from other countries like Canada and Australia, I find that they are well worth the effort. So what can you do right now, today, at your organization to get started on obtaining grants? Well, besides finding the right funders for your projects, here are some suggestions. Write an introduction of your nonprofit using grant language as opposed to fundraising language. At some point, you're going to need this, so why not do it now? You all know the missions of your organizations, so dust off the old term paper skills and start doing some research. What national or international data best identifies the problem or issue your missions seek to remedy? What might this data look like on a more statewide or regional scale? List some examples of how this plays out locally. Here again, eventually you will need this data and you will have to keep it updated. There's no better time to start than the present. And finally, I'm sure you all have a project or two in mind. What are your rather lofty but achievable goals for these projects? Can you write out 3 or 4 measurable objectives that lead toward the attainment of your goals? A good rule of thumb to ask yourself is whether or not your measurable objectives will add to the field of study that surrounds your mission. So thank you for your time today. It's been really great to get a chance to talk to you, and I sincerely hope you're walking away from this webinar not only with some valuable grant writing information, but also with a glimpse at what grant reviewers are expecting from you. I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dennis, and Sarah Jordan as well, for sharing really a tremendous amount of terrific information. We are about to get to the questions from our audience members, but before we do, we want to take just a quick moment to hear what it is that you think about today's presentation. So on the right side of your screen, you'll see that an evaluation poll just opened up. There are 10 quick questions. You'll need to use the scroll bar on the right to get to all those questions. Again, if you've joined on a mobile device, you won't be able to complete the polls, but if you have comments, feel free to submit those in the chat. All right, so while you're completing the evaluation poll, let's hear about how you can ask questions. So I'm going to ask Jennifer, our operator, to come back on the phone and give us instructions for asking a question verbally.
Thank you. If you would like to ask a question over the phone, please press *1 on your touch-tone phone, unmute your phone, record your name clearly after the prompt, and I will introduce you for your question. Again, that's *1 to ask a question. If you need to withdraw your question, you may press *2. One moment, please, for incoming questions.
All right, and of course, now that the poll is open, the Q&A panel has closed. So to reopen the Q&A panel, you'll just need to click the small triangle next to the letters Q&A to reopen that. We do have a lot of questions already in queue, so we'll begin with the first one. Let's see. So this comes from PJ, who says, what if I submit the grant towards the end of my year and I'm not able to ensure that the grant is going to be carried out? Will someone have the job of reporting to the foundation on the grant? So, Dennis, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, and I'm assuming that they mean the VISTA year.
Yeah, the VISTA year.
Okay, so you're submitting a grant, and you're close to your time being up. And I mean, this is typically, actually, this happens quite a bit. Unfortunately, in this field, there's a lot of personnel movement between organizations. So somebody will write a grant proposal and submit it, and it may get funded, and then leave or have left before that decision was made. There's always an executive director or somebody in a position of leadership that's going to have to sign the grant contract or the grant agreement. And I'm sure that person would have the responsibility of placing someone into that role to follow through with the grant to make sure that the project plays out completely. If that's not possible, then the alternative would be to actually turn the grant down. And, you know, it's really hard for a nonprofit to do that, but it happens. Sometimes there's just nobody there to manage the project, or, you know, they're not capable of doing it at the time. So that's typically what happens in a scenario like that.
All right, great. So basically, it's probably not the VISTA who's going to sign the contract or the agreement with the funder. It would be somebody at the organization.
Yes.
Terrific. So a question came from Joan. She says, could you please address the requirement of matching funds, both in grants or for fundraising campaigns?
There is a whole science behind this, because the first thing you have to do with matching funds is find out who gives them. And some foundations do with a grant, and others do just with their employee giving. And in my experience, what you need to do is try to determine who gives matching funds, and the best way to do that is not to pay a lot of money for these research organizations that will tell you that, but ask your constituency. Ask them to go to their employer and say, do you offer matching funds for my philanthropic activity? And if they say yes, that's fantastic. There's usually a form that you have to fill out. So if you give $100, that $100 comes to the nonprofit. The executive director or someone signs the form, returns it to you. You take it to your place of work, and they write a check to the nonprofit as well. With grants, it's more of a formal thing. A lot of times, for instance, here in Indianapolis, we have Lilly Endowment, and they will typically do a dollar-for-dollar match on some type of a grant proposal so that they know that they're not the only ones involved in this funding. So, for instance, if you're going to have an endowment for an education foundation and you want to raise $500,000 for the endowment, you may go to Lilly and say, would you provide a dollar-for-dollar match on that so that we end up with $1 million? And that's usually something that you would ask for in a proposal, you know, for a matching grant. It's not something that Lilly would do automatically. You would have to ask for that.
All right, great. Let's see, Catherine has a question relating back to the needs statement. And she said, how do you research to get the adequate data for your proposal, especially if you're writing grants for multiple clients?
I always just start from the basics, and I would ask Sarah Jordan for her opinion on this too. But if I'm going to do, for instance, going back to Project C.R.O.A.K, if I'm going to do a project on environmental education, I want to know generally what that topic's about, nationally, I should say. So I'm going to just read some articles and, you know, figure out where environmental education is at the present state in this country, and just kind of get a real 30,000-foot view of environmental education. And then I'm going to drill it down into the state level or maybe the regional level and see, you know, does the national state of affairs match what's happening in my state or in my community. And then I'm just going to keep whittling it down into a classroom or even an individual student until I've completed that inverted wedge. That's typically how I do it. It's kind of a mini research paper. So, Sarah Jordan, do you do it any differently than that?
I don't. You hit the nail on the head. I start at the national level and Google that way. Sometimes if I can't access the articles I need because they are a part of a scholarly publication, I might email a professor that I had in college and ask if they can help me out, or go to the local library and see if they have a subscription, because sometimes that can be tricky. But I start at the national level and also whittle my way down, and I find that I often end up talking to individuals as well at partnering organizations in the school district or at a foundation who's done some research to really get a grasp of the whole situation.
Great. Thank you, Sarah Jordan and Dennis both. Jennifer, let's go to you, see if we have any callers on the phone.
We currently do not have any questions over the phone. Again, if you would like to ask a question, please press *1 on your touch-tone phone. Unmute your phone, record your name clearly after the prompt, and I will introduce you for your question.
All right. Great. Well, we will continue with the questions we have from the Q&A. So Kelly has a great question. She says, in my city, there are a lot of organizations that do similar work. How can we stand out with our letter of inquiry? So, Sarah Jordan, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. I think earlier in the presentation, Dennis talked about in your letter of inquiry. You mentioned it in the full proposal, but you can even do this in a few sentences in your letter of inquiry. When you introduce yourself, go ahead and talk about if you've gotten an award, if you've been recognized for something, if you have a unique project that has received funding or something like that. Go ahead and look at what your organizations are doing. You may share a similar mission, a similar vision or focus, but the way you go about doing the things are probably very different. And so just emphasize that. What do you think, Dennis?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I would emphasize not only, because Sarah Jordan's talking about the content of your LOI, let me speak for a second about the style of it. Put yourself in this person's shoes. It's got to read all of these LOIs, and there's usually hundreds of them. I mean, you usually go to a hotel, and you sit in the lobby or you sit in some room, and somebody gives you a box, and it's full of LOIs, and they're all pretty much going to say the same thing. And after about 30 minutes, you start reading these things, and people are just trying to just wow you, you know. We're the greatest school in the world, and we've gotten all the awards ever given to a school. And so then you get a headache because you're rolling your eyes so much. And the way to stand out, this makes no sense at all, but it's true. The way to stand out is to not stand out. It's really to be very clear with exactly what you want. If I can read in your first paragraph that this is what you want, I'm going to go, okay, there's no problem here. I know specifically what they're going to do. I have an idea about what their objectives are going to be, and they're telling me that they want $50,000 or whatever. I'm going to put this over here because this was really easy to read, and it didn't give me a headache. So I'm very serious. When we sit and review grants, we look for simplicity and clarity and just very concise writing. But you'd be surprised at the number of people that try to impress you with the 30-weight marbled paper and the font that you can't read, just all these annoying things that will not get you read. That's just a fact of life. You're not going to get read if you do all that. Follow the directions. Make it very clear and simple.
All right. Well, a related question came from Janice. She says, as it relates to the language of the grant, what's the best way to ensure that your choice of words is sufficient?
I think that if I always like to have somebody else read my proposals, and I want to make sure that I'm not, being pretentious or anything, that it's very clear to read, that there's no question as to what I want in that grant or what I'm trying to say. Sometimes it's difficult to write that way because you're too close to it. You need to step away from it and have someone else read it, edit it, whatever you need to do. But it's always kind of a good team effort to have that. But again, my advice would be to stay simple, stay clear, have someone read your work, and, you know, don't try to impress anybody with big giant words and flowery adjectives, because that's not going to work. Sarah Jordan?
I agree. I actually just asked somebody in the office the other day who was really far removed from the project, who really only even knew the name of the project, to review the grant proposal, and I send them sections at a time. I send them, some grantors will actually send how it will be measured, what the criteria is that your grant will be measured against in terms of content. And so I send her those, and then I send her the chunk that I've written for that day. And I just ask her, like, you know, please look for flowery language, look for editing, and then also just review content. I agree. Finding somebody who's kind of removed from the project is probably the best way to go for that.
All right. Sounds like you've got some good colleagues there who can sort of almost put on the hat of a grant reviewer and say, hey, if you were going to score this, what would you give me?
Right.
Our next question is actually for you, Sarah Jordan. Erica says, what did you find the most challenging part of the grant writing process?
Yeah, I saw that in the Q&A chat. It made me chuckle a little. My years at Vista, the toughest part about writing a grant was not even necessarily the writing portion. It really is almost like writing a research paper, and if you've done that, you just apply those skills. The toughest part for me with grants is all the moving pieces. If you need somebody to help you with the research, or if you have an evaluation consultant who's going to help you come up with the questions to ask or what the evaluation process looks like, or if somebody's writing a letter of recommendation on your behalf, getting all those pieces moving and making sure that people are staying on top of what they're responsible for was tough, because sometimes the deadline creeps up before you know it, and you've got to get all these things back in that you weren't necessarily responsible for. And so the toughest part for me was learning that project management piece and being able to give other people deadlines that were sooner than the actual deadlines so I could have all of the elements I needed.
I'm chuckling because that's exactly what I do. Everybody gets hung up on the writing, and it's really not the writing portion that's the most difficult. It's the people management portion. I've even gone so far as to lie to people about the deadline so that I actually had another month, and let them all panic and get their things to me at the very last minute. And then I can take a deep breath because now I have a month to actually write it, and put it together the right way. I wouldn't condone that, but I've done it before. I'm admitting that. But it's really getting everyone together, getting on the same page, making sure that people hit the deadlines they're supposed to hit. And that's just in good management and good leadership. But I think the point is don't fear the writing part. Don't get hung up on it, because as long as you're clear and concise and you're saying exactly what you want, then you're going to be fine with the writing.
All right. Next question we have, the Vista who is in an organization that has a number of different initiatives that they're supporting, and they want money for all of these different initiatives, but she says, I'm having a hard time narrowing down which specific areas they want funding for. So any advice on helping to narrow down when your organization is doing so many different things?
Well, the advice I would give is, if it's a very common mistake to have a need for things like third-grade computers, for instance, and then go to somebody and say, you need to write us a grant for that. Well, now all of you know the definition now of a grant, and you know that a grant is not a gift. So the best way to narrow this down into the different initiatives is to kind of force the issue of writing objectives, write a goal and write objectives. If you have an initiative for homelessness, then I would talk with your executive director or whoever's in charge of that and say, okay, what exactly are we going to do and what are we going to measure? So that might be the best way to start a grant, is to, come up with the objectives first, and then at least you have some direction and you have some clarity in terms of your project. It tends to really kind of give you a laser focus, and that's what you need.
Great.
I would agree. Another thing that I found very helpful, I was working for an organization that had several programs working with different populations, but essentially the mission and the goal and the values were the same. And so I met with the director, and I just gave the suggestion, why don't we umbrella all of these programs under one fund and call it maybe the education fund or something. That way, when I write grants, I can really talk about a variety of these programs or one program or the fund itself, and whatever money goes into that fund can be used for any of these programs. That's one way I've done it. And then another way that I've done it is I've also sat down with the director and asked them, you know, what program, what fund uses, you know, what costs the most, what uses the most, what is at the core of your mission, and let me just start there. So sometimes you just kind of have to go in and ask somebody to help you narrow your focus, somebody who has been a part of the organization for a while, whose heart is for the mission, and just ask them, where do you need to begin?
All right, great. Let's turn to the phones. And Jennifer, do we have any callers in queue?
We currently do not have any questions over the phone.
Okay, great, thanks. Let's see, here's a question. So in a case where you're going to contact the funder, and the person who wrote this didn't specify what the circumstances, but who would be the best person to contact or call the funder? Would it be the executive director or the grant writer?
I think that's less important than making sure that you are actually given permission to make that call. A lot of times if you just cold call a foundation or some other type of funding organization, you're not going to be well received, because that's not their system. Their system might be for you to write an LOI. It might be to do an online application. It might be something along those lines. And you know, I hate to say it, but you're not special. So you know, if you make the phone call because you think you are, you could be in a lot of trouble. And, you know, they're probably going to remember that. But in terms of who makes the call, I think that's probably less important. I think it should be the person that knows the most about the project. If that's the executive director, great. If it's not, if it's the VISTA or the director of development, then it should be them.
I would agree. This looks different for when I'm working for an organization and when I'm freelancing. So when I freelance grant write, I'm never the one who calls the funder, because somebody has hired me out to write this grant. So all of the communication needs to go through them, because once I have finished my contract with writing, I'm not a part of the project. So that it looks different in that context. Where I'm working now, a lot of the time I will ask my director and the CEO, do you know anybody in these organizations? And if they have a contact, they're making that contact, and I'm sitting in on the phone call. I do wait for permission. If they say, no, Sarah Jordan, you go ahead and make that contact. We trust you. You've been here long enough. You know about the program. So I would agree with Dennis. It's going to be whoever knows the most about the program or whoever has a contact with the organization you're applying to.
All right, great. I see we have more questions here than we're going to have time to get to all of them. So we'll do our best to get to a number of them. And I will mention, I noticed a few of you had sent in questions about how to find grants or how to do that research. That's really beyond this session, but we do have some resources on the campus that can help you with those. So let's see. Amanda says, you know, what are the averages on successful grant applications? So for every X number of applications you send out, how many will typically be awarded? Dennis, do you have any, you know, kind of ballpark?
You really can't. Yeah, you really can't do that. It's not that sort of a formula. It depends on how good your proposal is. It depends on how good you've matched your philanthropic goals with that of the funder. It matters how well you've written. It matters if you have contacts with that organization. There's all those different things. So you might write 100 grant proposals to organizations that fill none of those categories and have 100% failure rate. You might write 100 grant proposals and 25% of those are affiliated somehow, maybe with a board member or a community person, or you've made an exact match with the foundation or something really good on your side, and you might have a 25% success rate. So I hate to say it all depends on any question, but in this case it really does all depend on all those different factors.
Okay, great. Yeah, seems like it couldn't be that simple, otherwise everybody would be rolling in grants.
Right.
Let's see, in the time we've got left, we'll focus on a couple. So Corinne has a question. Would you recommend using a college or university office of sponsored projects that can often support collaborative grant projects? And she said, I'm speaking specifically to the indirect cost rate that would be associated with partnering with the college or university. Do you have any experience with that?
Yeah, I've done that before, and that's really a good idea, because you're teaming up with the big muscle man in your community. I mean, any college or university, they've got offices full of experts in grant writing, and if you can partner with one of those entities and make use of their resources, or even get tucked in under their indirect cost, that's just great. That looks really good on a resume for you. It looks good on an introduction. So when you go out and try to get your own grant of some sort, you can say, well, we were partnered with the University of Virginia, whatever, with this particular project. We were one of the implementers. Well, that's going to tell the funder that you've got experience and you know what you're doing, and you'll probably be a good steward of this grant. So anytime you get an opportunity to team up with that big, giant, university or college entity, then you should take that.
All right, terrific. And let's see, this maybe have to be our last question. It's a little bit of a big one. Emily says, what is the best way to approach sustainability, measurability, and attainability concerns for a grant proposal before you actually write it?
Sarah Jordan, would you like that one?
Sure. So often, even before I begin the writing process, I do read through what the grant questions are, because sometimes, even though we went over the 10-page proposal, as Dennis said, if a funder gives you directions and guidelines, you follow those. And so I always read through the questions. For me, I grab our program and education department, and I sit down and I talk about what the grant is intended for, and we talk through all of the questions. So we can go ahead and start brainstorming with as many people as possible in the room how to address sustainability or measurability. Is what we're trying to do actually something that we can measure? If not, is there a creative way to measure it? I'm thinking specifically of a different museum I worked for that wanted to test children's knowledge on financial concepts, but we were teaching children who didn't quite know how to write yet. So what did we have them do? We can have them color a picture of what they're learning. And some funders, you need to pass it by them first. Some funders will accept that because you are working within the child's cognitive abilities. But that came from a conversation I was having with the program department before even writing the grant on how are we going to actually measure what we say we will do. So I would encourage just a group collaboration at that point.
I would like to add, Sarah Jordan mentioned how to be creative in an evaluation and gave a good example. I love that part of a grant proposal because evaluations can be really boring and dry, and, it's a pre-test or a post-test or whatever. However you can jazz that up, the funder's just going to love that. And it might be as simple as, rather than have a paper test, you do it online, or you just have some fun with it. But yeah, you know that you have to measure something. So let's be creative about how we do that, and we'll put that in the proposal, and your funder is just going to absolutely love that.
All right. Well, thank you, Dennis and Sarah Jordan, both, for not only the answers to these questions, but for the whole presentation, all the research you did and pulling this together. Thanks to all of you who participated today. We really appreciated all of your interaction and responsiveness and the questions. Apologies to those whose questions we were not able to answer. And I hope that you'll be able to join us for one of our upcoming webinars. On November 10th, we'll have a session that explores implicit bias and perception and how that might impact your VISTA service. And then on November 15th, we have a webinar that looks at high-impact volunteer recruitment, both of them at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can find them on the webinars page of the VISTA campus, so you can sign up for these and other webinars. We'll also be sending you emails so that you can find the links right in your inbox. So I want to thank you all again today and thank our producers, Bethany and Joanne, for their assistance today. We look forward to seeing you again soon.